All right, folks, I'm ready to get started. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to the day after the second exam. So congratulations to all of you on making it through that second exam. And now being at this point in the semester, we are in the last final stretch of the class. Just roughly, let me see, this is the 11th, 12th week, about 4 to 5 weeks left, roughly, including finals. So not a lot of time left, but definitely a lot to do. So this is the time to be all in. Some of you were all in on the exam, and you did well. So congratulations to you that did well in the exam, that wound up in the A or B category, as well as especially those that actually earned 80s and 90s on the exam, earning legitimate A's and B's on the exam, meaning that you would earn an A or a B in any class, in any setting, around any type of folks taking this exact course. And that's something you should be very proud of, because it shows that you have the kind of determination, drive, dedication that will make you very competitive in the world against even the most competitive people, regardless of what their backgrounds are or where they did their schooling. So keep that up. Those of you that are at that level, keep it up. Don't let any of this stuff like make you feel too comfortable and feel like, oh, well, it's okay to kind of just like, you know, not do as well as I do, because in the end, I'll still do well, I'll still get good grades. That's not enough. That's not enough in this world. Like, you need to be at the top of your game all the time. Here, figuring out that you can do it, that you are comfortable doing it, that it is an automatic response to you. And therefore, when you get out there, your guns will be blazing, in figurative terms, and you will succeed, and things will work out for you. To those people in the middle, you just made it by. It wasn't quite enough effort to get you to those like higher stratas, but the semester's not over yet. The game is still afoot, and so there's still a chance for you to kind of move your way up to a better grade. But in the end, like, I will not just give out grades. In the end, a lot of this is curved. Points are being given out, and so nobody will have any right whatsoever to come to me and say, oh, well, I deserved a higher grade because of this. No, you didn't deserve a higher grade. You got what you got, and you maybe even deserve something lower, but you got something higher than what you should have gotten. So don't ever, ever come to me at the end and say, oh, well, you know, I deserve this and that, because that's not how it is. That's not how this works. We talked about what it takes to do well in this class from day one. And if you're doing that, you earn a good grade. If you're not doing that, you earn a grade. And that's the grade you earn. And that's the grade that you have to accept and walk away with. If you wound up in the bottom stratas, you are dangerously close to not passing this class. There's a decent chunk of people that will not pass this class with a C or better. And that's just based on the performance of the class. We have 54.4 average on the exam. That's fairly low as far as averages go. So because of that, like, I just can't like just pass the majority of the people, like, it has to be very clear that like this class is a challenge and it must be met. And if you are not meeting that challenge, then you must retake the class and try again. And so that is your fate. If you continue to basically not do anything, because that's essentially what you would do to wind up in these categories here, basically nothing. Until the very end, you probably try to learn some of my practice exams and hope that that was enough, and that's not enough. Like, I am here day in and day out teaching you material that you are expected to learn. And if you do not learn that material, you do not pass the class. And that is the end of the story. There's no other way of looking at it. But this class aside, the grade aside, what's most important is like what this place is doing to you. And if you are not letting this place transform you into a person that is more dedicated, more driven than the person that you were when you walked into the school, then you're failing overall. And grades don't matter. In the end, what's going to matter is that, yeah, you may ultimately like get your way through this place and like earn a degree, and like here on my resume it says I have a degree. So you'll have that, but then, as soon as you try to get something out of this world, a piece of that pie that we all want that is so delicious, you know, the people that have that pie ready to give out are going to say, nah, not you. You're not the person for us, because it's very clear, it's very transparent that you just don't have what it takes. You don't have drive, you don't have dedication, you're not a go-getter, you're not willing to take that extra step, go that extra mile to learn whatever it is you need to learn to take down the challenge that you have taken on to the highest extent possible, to the best extent possible, maybe even pushing the limits of it. Maybe even discovering new information. Those are the type of people that flourish out there. Those are the type of people that are given the opportunities that all of you covet and all of you are very capable of getting if you were to put in as much work as you need to put in into what you do here. But if you're not doing that, it's not going to result in much, folks. And again, even if you're in this category here, like, you're teetering on the edge of just like not being able to even make it through a course like this. But again, like, you are not allowing this process to push you to, you know, broader limits of your capabilities than you are even aware that you are capable of achieving, which is what this whole thing is about. It's not just about like, oh, let me just check off the classes and like, oh yeah, I can write something on my degree, on my resume. Like, that's not what this is about. That's what a high school was about, you know, where you were just kind of like funneled through a system and like you had to be there and like it was basically a pseudo prison. Like, that's not what this is. Like, this is a choice that you made to better yourself. You pay money for it. I mean, it's like, it's all in your hands. And for you to do that and then just like say, whatever, like once you're actually in it and just like blow the whole thing and then just do the bare minimum, it's like you're not really doing you're not achieving anything. And it's unfortunate. And what it reflects is that you're not really looking out for yourselves to the extent that you need to look out for yourselves. Because I've stated this before and I'll say it again. Like, the world is very unforgiving and it is very ready to just chew you up and spit you out and forget all about you. It will do it, and it will do it quickly, and it will not care. That's just the world we live in. You see it every day on the news. You see the kind of people that exist in the world, powerful people that do not care about anybody. And that kind of attitude exists on every level. And the thing that those people ultimately do respect is like people like driven to succeed and like just ready to put it all on the line to achieve things. That is respected in this society. And if you have that, then you will be given opportunities. You will have the opportunity to move up the social ladder, etc. But if you're just kind of floating through here, you'll just float through here, you'll float right out, and then you'll float throughout the world, and then eventually nothing. Like, you'll just go into the sewer like that balloon in the It trailer, and that clown, that metaphorical clown, will get you, and that will be the end. I'm being dramatic, of course, and I'm being a little bit silly, just trying to lighten the mood. But nonetheless, in the end, like, you have to be serious about this, and it has to be for you. It cannot be for me. It cannot be for your classmates or your parents or whoever. It has to be for you. And if you're not looking out for yourself, you are losing probably the most important advocate you could have in this world. You know, the one person you can truly depend on all the time, yourself, regardless of what is going on in the world, regardless of what's going on with the people that you generally depend on that are also living life and have to deal with things and don't always have time to help other people. In the end, you have to be ready to just do everything it takes to make sure that things work out for yourself. And if you wound up over here, you're not doing that. And it's very clear. It is very clear. Yeah, it's very clear in this class how you can just kind of make it through. Like, yeah, okay, so kind of pay attention, kind of study the practice exams, kind of do the homework, and if you kind of do enough of that, you'll maybe kind of pass. Yeah, you're clever. Wow, you made it through this class. You got a C. Congratulations. Out there, that's not going to matter. That's not going to matter, and you can't just like do C work in the opportunities that you want to get that will get you far in this world. You can't. Like, you have to be there, like 100%. Like, I am here. I am dedicated. Oh, what? You need me to spend all weekend learning this one thing that's really boring, but it's going to help me to advance? So be it. I'm going to do it. You know, I need to be here 10 hours, 5 days a week for like a couple of months in order to achieve this one thing that will help the company and maybe, you know, help me advance. I'm going to do it. You know, like, that's what you need. And if you're not ready to, if you're not comfortable having that kind of dedication, which is what you can cultivate here by having that kind of dedication to your classes, etc., then you're not going to have it out there, and you can't fake it. And it's very transparent that you will not have it. You can't pretend So this is your chance, folks. Don't blow it. Like, really. And in the end, like, if you don't wind up passing this course, like, it doesn't reflect badly on you personally. Like, you are fully capable of, like, getting an A in this course, getting an A in every course. Like, that is also one of the true failures. If you actually do believe, based on the fact that you maybe wind up down here all the time, that you are incapable of actually doing better in a class like this, and that is ridiculous. You are all capable of being up here and higher, and it's all a function of how much time you put into it and how well you manage your time. Some of you work full time, and if you're working full time, that's not an excuse. Like, you need to be an adult about your situation and realize, I have to work and go to school, so I shouldn't be taking as many classes as I'm taking, and I need to accept the fact that it's going to take me longer to finish college. But you'll finish college, and it'll be more effective. You'll learn stuff, you'll actually learn things, and you'll do well in your classes, and you'll feel good about what you're doing, and in the long run, it will be better for you. So you need to be an adult and realistic about that, and just manage your time better, prepare your schedule better in the beginning of a semester to make sure that you don't wind up in these situations where you just don't have time to do anything. You know, like, you don't want that to be the case, and you need to be realistic about it. Part of being a responsible, successful person is having that sort of realistic outlook on things versus, like, I'm just going to fit in whatever I can into my plate, and then just, you know, it all kind of just falls off your plate, and then failure. I don't want you to fail. Don't fail. This is not the end of the world. The class is not over. There's still opportunities. There's still a final. There's still a paper, etc. But really, if you've been in these categories, it's not looking good, folks. It's not looking good. I can't really say much to you at this point. At this point, it's all up to you. If you either you turn it around or you don't. Like, that's it. One thing that all of you should know is that the final itself is not curved. So you get points out of 100. And then I multiply that by the 20% that it's worth, and then that adds to your final points, and then I curve the grades. So I don't have a curve for the actual final. I do brackets for your grades in the end. So you don't depend on calculations you make based on things that have happened in the past, because that's not how curves work. It's all relative. In the end, if you are not earning like A's and B's, you are not entitled to anything. So again, either you're earning those or you're not going to get it, and you can't convince me otherwise. So that's something that needs to be very clear to you right now, okay? Beyond that, I'm going to pass the exam at the end of the class once I finish with the lecture, and I'll take any questions. I see a hand up. No, it is not. It's just going to cover the last 4 chapters we cover, which is chapters 9 through 12, I think. Other questions? All right, folks. Yeah, it just really, like, you got to turn it around. The folks that aren't doing that well, you got to turn it around. And it's not about turning around your grade, like I already said. It's not about that. It's about turning around your life, because it's very clear that you are not approaching this the right way. And if the approach doesn't change now, it's not going to change later. And things are going to be a lot more serious later. It's not just going to be a letter on some paper or like on a digital platform, A or B. It's not going to be that anymore. It's going to be, can I pay my rent? Can I buy this meal that I want to buy? You know, can I afford these things? Like, it's going to be those things, you know? And yeah, in the end, like, college degrees will get you some stuff, but like, it's all about long term. Like, life is long. Like, you want to be able to lay the groundwork, foundations for like a successful life where you will continue to sort of, you know, advance in, again, our social ladder and get more out of this world, so that you can be satisfied with the results that you get from everything that you put in here, which is a lot. You know, you put in a lot. Even those of you that aren't doing too well, you're putting in a decent amount of effort, and that could lead to nothing. So, I mean, that's unfortunate. Don't let that happen to you. All right, folks, let's move forward with the material. So we have been, again, using our cost-benefit framework in terms of, in this case, marginal analysis, to study optimal decisions by firms in varying market contexts, which ranged from the most competitive market context, perfect competition, to the least competitive market context, monopoly. And then we looked at the first sort of hybrid in-between case, which was monopolistic competition, which involved you know, a lot of competition, but also some market power, some ability for the firms to charge prices above their marginal cost, because they were able to generate the idea in consumers' minds based on comparative advertising that their product is slightly different from their competitors. And that then provided them a situation where they had their own downward sloping demand curve, and they were able to optimize their behavior in a way that generated some profits. Generally, those profits will be greater than what you would see in the short run for like a perfectly competitive firm. But in the long run, those profits would be eroded, just like in perfect competition. Not the case with monopoly. Anyway, so the last case we're going to talk about, and the one that's going to require a couple of chapters to cover, is oligopoly. It's the most common market setting that firms find themselves in. It involves a small amount of large firms, large meaning that they have a large market share, dominating the market. And what's most tricky about this market setting is that there is interdependence in decision making, meaning that the firms share the market essentially. And so it's not just about them like looking at demand and then looking at their costs and figuring out what should we do. It's also, what are my rivals doing? Because they need to know what their rivals are doing, because what their rivals are doing is going to affect what they should do, because they're sharing a downward sloping demand curve. So if a rival decides to increase output, the entire market moves along the demand curve. And so everybody needs to take that into consideration. If they don't, then they will not be optimizing their behavior, and they could potentially be hurting themselves, maybe to the extent that they are priced out of the market. Of course, the other thing that these firms understand that is a possibility is that they could be working together. They could work together, and if they do, they could benefit from the market the way a monopolist does. A monopolist is able to benefit from markets the most. They're able to get the most amount of profit from the market. And these firms understand that, but of course they are competing against each other, and they cannot work together because laws stop them from working together. It's illegal for these firms to just get together and say, let's rig the market. And so they want to, they can't. There's sort of ways of getting around that, and they're tricky, and so that's part of what we'll examine in the models that we'll look at here, is just incorporating the fact that there's interdependence in decision making, but also taking into consideration the possibility of collusion, working together, and sort of the implications of that. And so that's what the next two chapters are about. This chapter, we cover 4 different oligopoly models. First, we'll cover today the conditions for oligopoly. Then we'll briefly talk about the role of beliefs. Again, like, firms have to take into account what their rivals are doing, but they can only have a belief about what their rivals are going to do, because their rivals are not going to straight up say, hey, I'm doing this. It's like they obviously they're competing against each other. So there's only so much information that firms have, so they therefore have to base a lot of their behavior on what they believe their rivals are going to do, and that's going to change the result of a lot of what the firms will do in the models that we examine. And that's what will differentiate the models, the 4 models that we cover in this chapter that have to do with profit maximization, of course, of the oligopolists. They differ with respect to the belief about what their rivals are doing. So today we'll cover one of the models, the Sweezy oligopoly, and then we'll cover, I think, maybe all or most of the second one, which is the Cournot oligopoly. And then there'll be a couple more. Don't worry, I'll explain them. They're named after the people that came up with them, obviously. And then we'll cover the next one on Tuesday. And then the other one on Friday, on the following Thursday. And and then we'll move into chapter 10, which is game theory, which provides us a different sort of approach to trying to analyze this sort of interesting interdependent competitive situation that oligopolies find themselves in, by looking at those situations as games. So everybody's a player, and there's certain payoffs they can get based on the strategies that they might employ. It's a really useful tool. It helps to give us some certainty in the face of a lot of uncertainty, which is what ultimately is the main characteristic of these situations. It's like very uncertain, because again, you can't really know what everybody's doing. But again, like everything that we do in this class is meant to give you just like a baseline sort of intuitive understanding of how things could go, and then they're meant to sort of just be your base of understanding that you then compare real situations to, and maybe help you to sort of maneuver actual situations better than you would otherwise. So that's ultimately what all of this is about. All right, so we're going to cover these two models right now. Are there any questions you'd like me to address before I get going? Before I do move in, just as far as the paper goes, like make sure you guys are on top of the papers and get them done soon, because you are going to run out of opportunities very soon. Just look at the syllabus and look at the chapters, because and look at the deadline for the mini paper, the open chapter mini paper submission, because it's all coming up. And so for those of you that have left until the end, you're running out of time. And I'm not going to talk too much more about it because I've been talking about it the entire semester. But yeah, it's important that you, if you haven't done anything yet, to start doing things right now, or else the paper is going to be another red mark on your record, and that will drive you further down into the hole. Yeah. Oh, I haven't set that up yet. I'll set it up when the papers due. Yeah, I don't want people submitting final papers yet. But if you have the final paper, just sit on it, and when it comes up, you'll be able to submit it. But remember, you need to turn it as digital and a hard copy to me. We'll talk about all that as the day comes closer. And then also remember, so in a week and a half, on the 18th of April, we're not going to meet. So I'll remind you of that as well. Yeah. Yeah, just for the final paper. Yeah. Alrighty, so chapter 9, basic oligopoly models. Let's talk first generally about conditions for oligopoly. So oligopoly refers to a situation where there are relatively few large firms in an industry. No explicit number of firms is required in oligopoly, so there isn't just a direct number that we can say is oligopoly, but it usually ranges between 2 and 10. And we'll talk about the issues related to increasing more firms in these oligopolies and how that affects the market outcomes as we move through the chapter. The products that the firms may offer can be either the same or slightly different. So they can be identical, like in a perfectly competitive market, or they can be differentiated, as in a monopolistically competitive market. An oligopoly composed of only 2 firms is called a duopoly. And that's the case that we'll mostly consider in this class, just to kind of keep things simple. But of course, the results do extend past the simple case. Oligopoly is the most interesting of all the market structures, again, because there is that interdependence, and because most major industries that we are all engaged in as consumers are oligopolies. And so it winds up having a lot of relevance. From the viewpoint of the manager, a firm operating in an oligopoly setting is the most difficult to manage. As I mentioned, it's because of the interdependence, because it's not just the decisions you make based on what you know about your costs and your production and what demand looks like. It's also like, what are your rivals doing? So due to the complexity of oligopoly, there's no single model for oligopolistic markets like there is for a monopoly, like there is for perfect competition and monopolistic competition. We have one model for each of those. The situations are clear, the results are clear, they generally do the job that they need to as far as explaining how managers can best maneuver those settings. But again, that's not the case in oligopoly, because you never know what your rivals are going to do, and also it depends on the nature of the type of industry you may be operating in. So let's generally talk about the role of beliefs and strategic interactions with a couple of examples. So to gain understanding of oligopoly interdependence, consider a situation where several firms are selling slightly different versions, differentiated products in an oligopoly. In determining what price to charge, the manager must consider the impact of his or her decisions on other firms in the industry. Again, there's interdependence. You share a downward sloping demand curve. And so if you're making a decision, it's going to impact your rivals. Your rivals will react to that, and that will impact you, how they react. If the price of the product is lowered, if you lower the price of the product because you want to increase the amount of sales, you have to consider if your competitors are going to do the same thing. The same is the case for a price increase. The optimal decision of whether to raise or lower a price will depend on how the manager believes that other managers will respond. So again, it's all based on beliefs. So suppose a firm is initially at point B, supplying this amount Q naught at a price P naught. So this demand curve is based on the assumption that rivals will match any price change. So you lower your price, your rivals lower their price. You raise your price, your rivals raise their price. If that happens, if everybody behaves the same, then demand will be relatively inelastic, meaning that as you move along your demand curve, overall, like the elasticity will sort of be exactly what you would expect it to be. Now, this demand curve, D2, is based on the assumption that they will not match a price change. So you lower your price, and they will not lower their price, and therefore demand for you will become more elastic. It will be more responsive because, again, you change your price, your competitors don't. That means consumers will respond more to your demand. And so, therefore, your demand will look will respond more to your supply, and therefore demand will be more elastic, right? Remember, flatter demand curves represent more elastic demand. And again, if you raise your price and your competitors don't, then again, demand will be more elastic as well. So demand is more inelastic when rivals match a price change than when they do not match a price change. All right, so demonstration problem. Suppose a manager is at a point B charging a price of P naught. If the manager believes rivals will not match price reductions but will match price increases, what does the demand for the firm's product look like? Okay, so the manager believes that rivals will not match price reductions. So if rivals do not match price reductions, then demand will be more elastic. But they will match price increases. So again, you're operating here. They will match price increases. So that means demand will be more inelastic because they'll do exactly what you'll do to raise prices. So again, the answer is that the demand is going to look like this curve here. It's going to have a kink in it. It's going to be made up of both of these demands. So you're going to be at some point on your demand curve, supplying some amount at some price, and the fact that you believe that your rivals are going to not match price increases but match price decreases means that you should be thinking of demand in this way and therefore optimizing your firm behavior in response to this type of demand that is made up of these two different segments. Different scenario. If the manager believes rivals will match price reductions but will not match price increases, what does the demand for the firm's product look like? Well, in that situation, again, you just have to think about, like, if they are matching your price, then demand will be more inelastic because everybody's doing the same thing. So if you raise your price, then they will not match that, and that makes sense, really. Like, rivals generally will not want to raise their prices. If you raise your price, they'll be happy that you raise your price because then their stuff is cheaper. And so, this is a more realistic example. So again, if you raise your price and your rivals do not raise their prices, that means demand will be more elastic. So it'll be this segment here. And if you lower your price and your rivals also lower their price, which is, of course, a natural result of competition, like you're lowering your price, your rivals will likely lower their prices, then in that case, then demand is going to be more inelastic, so you'll have this segment here. So therefore, the demand will look like this curve here for this scenario. So again, it's all based on beliefs, and the beliefs are going to completely result in a different outlook on the market than you would normally, and therefore that outlook is what you would need to base your decisions on. So the optimal output decision for managers becomes complicated. Again, generally, a manager in a market that is facing a downward sloping demand curve will optimize their behavior by setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, set their optimal quantity, and then go up to the demand curve to figure out the price. So if the demand curve for a firm's product is given by D1, the manager will maximize profits where the marginal revenue associated with that curve equals marginal cost. And if the demand curve for the product is given by D2, then again, the manager will maximize profits where the marginal revenue associated with that demand curve equals the marginal cost. So the difficulty for the manager is determining whether or not rivals will match price changes or not. All right, now let's start looking at our 4 oligopoly models. And we're going to start with the Sweezy model, which is going to basically reflect everything we just did. So the following subsections examine profit maximization based on alternative assumptions regarding how rivals are going to respond to price or output changes. Each of the 4 models has different implications for the manager's optimal decisions, and these differences arise because of differences in the way that rivals respond to the firm's actions. All right, so the first model, the Sweezy oligopoly. The Sweezy model is based on the assumption regarding how other firms will respond to price increases and price cuts. An industry is characterized as a Sweezy oligopoly if, 1, there are few firms in the market serving many consumers, so that's an oligopoly. Again, few firms, lots of consumers, the firms have large market shares. The firms produce differentiated products, so in a Sweezy oligopoly, everybody produces something slightly different from each other. Each firm believes that rivals will cut prices in response to a price reduction, but will not raise their prices in response to a price increase. So essentially, the managers are faced with that second situation we just looked at, that, again, the more realistic one, where they assume that rivals will not match price increases, but will match price reductions. And of course, barriers to entry exist. We talked about why firms have monopoly power, and we talked about the barriers to entry, the cost advantages, the legal barriers that stop other firms from entering the market. Those barriers to entry also exist in oligopolies, but obviously they're not as severe to the extent that only one firm winds up basically defining the industry. A few firms are able to enter the market, but not too many. You have to be a certain size generally to be able to operate in the market. And so that's generally going to be the biggest barrier to entry, like the amount of fixed costs necessary to enter the market. And then the ability to take advantage of economies of scale, increasing returns to scale by, again, being able to operate at a good sort of segment along that long run average total cost curve, where they've minimized the cost of producing as much as possible by being as big as possible. All right, so as we just saw, for a firm that believes that their rivals are going to match their price reductions but not match their price increases, then the demand curve will look like this. It will kind of have that kink in it. So this is the Sweezy demand curve. For prices above P naught, so prices above here, then obviously the firm is going to be operating along this demand curve. And so this entire demand curve has a corresponding marginal revenue curve that looks like this. Again, it's got twice the slope in absolute value. So up until point B, the firm will be operating along this demand curve, and therefore this will be the marginal revenue curve associated with it. All right, so they believe that their rivals will match price reductions. That means that price will be more inelastic. That means they'll be operating along this demand curve beyond this price. So for prices below P naught, the marginal revenue curve that's relevant to the manager is going to be the one associated with this demand curve. So here's the marginal revenue curve, MR2, associated with D2. Again, twice the slope in absolute value of D2. And so therefore, beyond this price, the relevant marginal revenue is going to be this marginal revenue curve here. And so then connecting them, that's going to get us the Sweezy oligopoly marginal revenue curve. It's going to be this sort of weird zigzag marginal revenue curve. And that's going to have important implications right now for the profit maximizing decision. All right, so the profit maximizing level of output occurs where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and the profit maximizing price is the maximum price that consumers will pay for the level of output. So let's say marginal cost is up here. So if marginal cost is up here, marginal cost equals marginal revenue there. That means that Q naught will be the amount of output that will maximize profits. And the optimal price will, of course, be P naught. Of course, price exceeds marginal cost, so output is below the socially efficient level. You get that same sort of deadweight loss result that you get from any firm that has market power. Again, mutually beneficial transactions that could occur don't occur because the firms, take advantage of their market power and limit the amount of transactions that occur in the market by raising prices higher than they would normally be in a perfectly competitive outcome, which has the most efficient market outcome. All right, so an important implication of this Sweezy, yeah.
Can you explain why that the marginal revenue curve takes that straight? There's a point where it's just straight.
Well, I mean, again, it has to do with the fact that based on the beliefs, this is the demand curve that they face above the price, so that's the marginal revenue curve associated with that. Then beyond this point, then this is this demand curve, which has this marginal revenue curve associated with it. And so you need to then connect the two. And so then there is going to be this range over which the marginal revenue will remain constant as prices change for the firm. And that's going to have important implications, as we're going to see. So the important implication of the Sweezy model is that there will be a range, CE, over which changes in marginal cost will not affect the profit maximizing level of output. So here, let's say marginal costs were to decrease anywhere along this range because costs decrease for whatever reason. Maybe the firm, invests more fixed costs and they get on a different average total cost curve. And so their marginal cost winds up being less at every given possible output level. So they could be moving along this range in terms of their marginal cost. So here, if marginal costs were to decrease from MC0 to MC1, marginal revenue now equals marginal cost at point E, but the output corresponding to this point is still Q naught. So marginal cost drops, but the firm does not change their output. This is in contrast to competitive, monopolistically competitive, and monopoly, which are monopolistic firms, all of which increase when marginal costs decline, right? So firms operate at the point where marginal revenue equals their marginal cost. If marginal cost goes down, then marginal cost is less than marginal revenue. That means that they would then increase their output level. So that's just a natural result of being in that kind of competitive environment. When you're in a competitive environment where you believe your rivals will match your price reductions, but will not match your price increases, there's going to be a range over which if your costs go down, you shouldn't be changing your output level, just given the nature of demand. And so that's what this model is telling us. This model is giving us that insight. If your competitive setting is of this nature, where again, you face a few competitors and the conditions are such that you are in a Sweezy oligopoly, then you need to understand that there will be times where you shouldn't be changing your output level. So in a Sweezy oligopoly, firms have an incentive not to change their pricing behavior based on marginal costs, provided that marginal costs remain in a given range. The reason for this stems purely from the assumption that rivals will match price cuts but will not match price increases. Now, the Sweezy model has been criticized because it offers no actual explanation how the industry settles on that price that occurs where the kink in the demand curve happens. Like, what is that price? How do you figure it out? So in general, in practice, the initial price and a manager's beliefs may be based on a manager's experience and the pricing patterns of rivals in a given market. So ultimately, it will be a matter of the manager sort of just kind of operating in the market, figuring out, how rivals are operating with respect to a price versus another, and then ultimately being able to understand, okay, so this is the price where demand changes, and therefore that is, where the kink of my demand curve happens. So therefore now I can identify the range over which, if my costs change, I shouldn't be changing my output level. So if your experience suggests that rivals will match price reductions but will not match price increases, the Sweezy model will be relevant to your market. But again, it will take time for you to in practice, figure out how to translate the results of the model into, the actual experience that you are involved in. All right, so that's one of the Sweezy models. And again, it's all based on the fact that there is a belief again, about price increases and price decreases, because in this case, price is a big sort of component of competition. Now, let's say there was a different type of situation where the firms are maybe sharing a market, and the amount of output in the market is key. There isn't a lot. Maybe it's the oil market, and everybody's just kind of supplying as much as they can, given the limited amount of maybe demand there might be for this limited amount of the good that's being supplied. And so, in the end, the main dimension of competition for these firms will be quantity, like choosing a quantity to supply in the market in relation to what their rivals are doing. So imagine that a few large oil producers must decide how much oil to pump out of the ground. The total amount of oil produced will affect the market price of oil, but the underlying decision of each firm is not a pricing decision, but rather the quantity of oil to produce. That is the decision that's being made. So if each firm must determine its output level at the same time that other firms determine their output levels, or more generally, if each firm expects its own output decision to have no impact on their rivals' output decisions, then this scenario describes a Cournot oligopoly. Cournot is just a French guy who came up with this model. So an industry is a Cournot oligopoly if, of course, there are a few firms serving many consumers, which is what characterizes a oligopoly in general. The firms produce either differentiated or homogeneous products, either slightly different versions of what everybody's selling or the exact same thing. Each firm believes that rivals are going to hold their output constant if it changes its output. So that's the main sort of assumption, the main belief that each firm has about their rivals. That their rivals' output is constant, and so they just make decisions given that their rivals are choosing some amount. And really it has to do with the fact that everybody's choosing how much to supply at the same time, so nobody can know what their rivals are going to supply. So they can only assume that their rivals' output will be constant. Barriers to entry exist. Of course, that is what keeps other firms out, which is what creates the conditions for oligopoly. Yeah?
Output is that directly related or unrelated to like price and all that? Just the output just
Well, I mean, the output will affect the market price, right? Because both of them share a downward sloping demand curve, and so depending on how much they want to supply, they have to move along that curve, because ultimately consumers will only pay so much for certain quantities. And so that does matter. But like in terms of like their main sort of strategy of how to approach the market, like their main concern is like how much to supply, because that's ultimately what this type of market is characterized by, is like output. Like there's only so much to go around, there's only so much demand. But of course, costs do play into that, and we'll talk about that. All right, so in contrast to the Sweezy model, the Cournot model is relevant for decision making when managers make output decisions and believe that their decisions do not affect the output decisions of rival firms. All right, so normally when firms decide on their output, they set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. You're done. Figure out your optimal output to maximize your profits. But in a Cournot oligopoly setting, you're making an output decision. You're sharing a market with your rival. You're moving along a demand curve. That means your rival's also going to be affected by the fact that you're moving along the demand curve. So they're going to respond to that. So you need to take that into consideration. So your marginal revenue is going to be not just a function of your output decision, but their output decision as well. And so when you set your marginal revenue equal to your marginal cost, you're going to have an extra quantity variable in there, the quantity of your rival. And so instead of coming up with just like a straight like amount that you can solve for quantity, you're going to have a relationship between your quantity and your rival's quantity, which is called the reaction function, which will be a rule that you will follow to be able to set your output level in response to what your rivals may do in order to constantly be able to maximize your profits depending on what your rivals do. So suppose there's only two firms competing in a Cournot duopoly. Each firm makes an output decision, and each firm believes that its rival will hold output constant as it changes its own output. To determine its output level, firm 1 will equate marginal revenue with marginal cost. Since this is a duopoly, only two firms, firm 1's marginal revenue is affected by firm 2's output level. The greater the output of firm 2, the lower the market price, and thus the lower is firm 1's marginal revenue, which is why they need to take into consideration what their rivals are doing when they're thinking about their marginal revenue. So a greater output by firm 2 leads to a lower profit maximizing output for firm 1. So this relationship between firm 1's profit maximizing output and firm 2's output is called a best response or a reaction function. You can call it either. A best response, also called a reaction function, defines the profit maximizing level of output for a firm for given output levels of the other firm. The profit maximizing level of output for firm 1, given that firm 2 produces some amount, Q2, is going to be equal to some relationship. So firm 1 will be constantly reacting to firm 2's output level. So firm 1's output will be a function of firm 2's output in this relationship that we call the best response or the reaction function. For firm 2, given that firm 1 produces Q1 units of output, then their reaction function will be similar. It's just obviously their output will be a function of firm 1's output level. So one way to understand how these reaction functions work and how they lead ultimately to an equilibrium in the market where everybody kind of knows how much they should be supplying is by graphing these reaction functions, having the quantity of firm 2 on the y-axis and the quantity of firm 1 on the x-axis. So the Cournot reaction function for firm 1 in a duopoly is below, where firm 1's output is measured on the horizontal axis and firm 2's output is measured on the vertical axis. If firm 2 produced 0 units, so if firm 2 were to produce 0 units, then that means that firm 1 would be the only firm in the market. And so this corresponds to the monopoly output for firm 1, how much they would supply if they were able to dominate the market by themselves. So that's what that is. Q1M corresponds to a situation where firm 1 is a monopolist. Firm 2's reaction function is similar. So this is firm 2's reaction function telling firm 2 how much it should supply in reaction to how much firm 1 supplies. And if firm 1 were to supply 0, then firm 2 would be the only supplier in the market. They would be the monopolist. So that's what that output level is. This amount here. Again, this amount is how much they would supply, and firm 1 would supply 0. All right, if instead of producing 0 units of output, firm 2, let's say, produced Q2 star units, the profit maximizing level of output for firm 1, based on the fact that firm 2 produces Q2 star units, is to react optimally to it based on what its reaction function tells it to do, which means that it should produce Q1 star on its reaction function corresponding to that output level by firm 2. So the reason the profit maximizing level of output for firm 1 decreases as firm 2 output increases is as follows. When firm 2 increases its level of output, the demand and marginal revenue for firm 1 will decline. So the profit maximizing response by firm 1 is to reduce its output level, right? They set their output level initially at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, but we see that the marginal revenue will decrease. So at the level of output, marginal cost will be above marginal revenue, which means they need to lower their amount of output. Quick demonstration problem in the figure. What is the profit maximizing level of output for firm 2 when firm 1 produces 0 units of output? What is it when firm 1 produces Q1 star units of output? This is a silly demonstration problem. I was actually going to delete it. I forgot to delete it. It's just basically the same thing I just covered. So if firm 2, when firm 1 produces 0, that means firm 2 will produce obviously the monopoly amount. And when firm 1 produces Q1 star units, firm 2 will produce Q2 star units, again in response to what firm 1 does based on the reaction function that they have. Again, that rule that they follow that helps them to set their output level given the fact that they are interdependent in decision making. All right, so that's that. I need to get rid of this. I will. All right, to examine equilibrium, so the point where the market is sort of at rest, where nobody's like interested in changing, and ultimately being the amounts that the two firms will choose to supply. Remember, the firms don't know what their rivals are going to do, and they only have an idea of what their rivals are going to do. They have a belief about it, and they're choosing their supply, their quantity at the same time. So it's like they're not actually reacting to each other, but they're setting up. They have this framework that allows them to figure out, well, if this were to happen over time, then what is going to be the best result? Well, the best result will be the equilibrium in the market where the two firms intersect. So let's examine why that is. So to examine equilibrium in a Cournot duopoly, suppose firm 1 produces Q1M. So firm 1 is a monopolist. And then all of a sudden, firm 2 is able to overcome the barriers to entry, invest however much is needed to invest in to get into the market. And they do, and that sort of changes the nature of the market. Now it's a duopoly. So in response to firm 1 producing Q1M units of output, firm 2 will produce this amount on their best response reaction function, corresponding to how best they should respond to Q1M. So they will respond by producing this amount. Given this positive level of output by firm 2, the profit maximizing level of output for firm 1 will no longer obviously be Q1M and will correspond to point B on R1. So firm 2 would produce this amount based on firm 1's best response function. Their best response is to produce this amount to maximize profits. Given this reduced level of output by firm 1, point C will be the point on firm 2's reaction function that maximizes profits. So in reaction to firm 1 producing this amount, firm 2 now needs to produce this amount to maximize their profits. And given this new output by firm 2, firm 1 will again reduce output to point D on its reaction function. And then that process will continue until the market gets to this point there where the two firms, where the two reaction functions intersect, which is the Cournot equilibrium, which is the point at which the market is doing the best it possibly can. So these changes in output will continue until point E is reached. The same will happen if the process started on the other side. If firm 2 was the monopolist, and then firm 1 entered, so then it would react this way, and then firm 2 would react this way, and then firm 1 would react this way, and then that would get them to the equilibrium as well from the other side of the equilibrium. So at point E, firm 1 produces Q1 star and firm 2 produces Q2 star. Neither firm has an incentive to change its output given that it believes the other firm is going to hold output constant at that level. So point E is the Cournot equilibrium. So just formally defined, Cournot equilibrium is a situation where neither firm has an incentive to change its output level given the output of the other firm. Again, graphically, this condition corresponds to the intersection of the reaction curves. All right, so that's the Cournot equilibrium graphically. So obviously the next step is to take it to the math, so let's do that. So given estimates of the demand and cost within a Cournot oligopoly, we can explicitly solve for the Cournot equilibrium mathematically as well. To maximize profits, a manager in a Cournot oligopoly produces where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So that stays the same. It's just the nature of marginal revenue changes because of the beliefs that, again, the rivals will hold output constant. So the calculation of marginal cost is done just as in other market structures we have analyzed. So the marginal cost part of that whole quantification is the same. So marginal cost, again, just reflects the nature of a production process, as we talked about in chapter 5. So the calculation of marginal revenue is a little bit more subtle. So the formula for a marginal revenue for a Cournot duopoly, if the inverse market demand in a homogeneous product Cournot duopoly is given by just a regular sort of inverse demand function, but again, quantity is not just a quantity that's being supplied in the market by one firm, it's being supplied by, in this case, two different firms. And each subscript denotes the fact that each quantity variable is specific to a different firm. So those quantity variables are different from each other. That was part of what a lot of you didn't get right on that question with the monopolists choosing how much to produce in each firm, and that I think it was one of the questions on the exam. You didn't understand that like the quantity variables were separate variables. Like you you tried to solve the problem with having just one quantity variable, and that just didn't make sense and it didn't work out. So you have to acknowledge that, like, if there's two firms, each of them have a control variable, an ability to set a quantity that they're going to supply, and so each quantity variable is going to be different from the other. So the subscripts denote two separate quantity variables. They're not the same quantities. They're different variables. You can call them X and Y if you want, but just so that you remember that they are two different variables. But as far as like the model goes, it's best to just kind of keep it at Q and leave the subscripts there to kind of denote the fact that 1 and 2 correspond to the output of firm 1 versus firm 2. All right, so yeah, you can, of course, just distribute that out. And A and B, of course, are constants, positive constants. So the marginal revenues of firm 1 and firm 2 will then be, so firm 1, the marginal revenue is going to be this. They're going to take firm 2's output as constant. So you have A minus BQ2. So that's going to be the constant for the firm. So that's basically firm 1's perspective on the market. Their rival's output is going to be considered constant. So they include it in the constant so that in this A then becomes A minus BQ2 for firm 1's perspective on the market. And then you have negative BQ1 being, again, the slope and then the variable that they can actually affect. So then that's their perspective on demand. And then to get their marginal revenue, you just double the slope in absolute value as you normally do. So again, that's what firm 1 did. It took firm 2's output as constant, and then you had negative BQ1, and then you just double that. So that's where the negative 2BQ1 comes from there. And then the market will have a symmetric marginal revenue curve for firm 2. It'll just be exactly the same thing, just with the subscript switched. Basically, it takes the output of firm 1 as constant, and then to get its marginal revenue, it doubles what we call the residual demand, the demand that corresponds to it, that it is in control of. This essentially its monopolist demand, because once they consider the output level of their rival as constant, they are essentially a monopolist over the remaining market, the residual market demand. Anyway, so you have A minus BQ1 as a constant, and then you have minus BQ2 as the firm 2's perspective on the inverse demand function. And then to get the marginal revenue, you just double that. So that's where the 2BQ2 comes from. Yeah.
The first part is for the company 1 and the second part for the company 2.
Mm-hmm.
And the first one, Q1, Q2, is the potential part in one company.
No, it's the, remember, marginal revenue is a function of what both of them do. And so, because demand is a function of what both of them do, and you always have to take into consideration what the other firms are doing. And so the actual thing that's being sold is the same. It's just this corresponds to how much firm 1 decides to supply of that one thing. It's oil, let's call it. Let's just say it's oil. And then this corresponds to how much firm 2 decides to supply of oil. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, but 2 firms, right?
Of course. We're looking at a Kuno duopoly. Yeah. So it's a simple case of what a market like this can look like, but it can be like a Kuno, like a Kuno oligopoly with like 5 firms or 8 firms, and so there would be 8 quantity variables in those cases, and each one would have a marginal revenue and marginal cost, and there would be more reaction functions. But obviously, you can't. It's easy to just kind of demonstrate how this all works with just 2 firms. So those are the marginal revenues of each firm. And then you can solve for the reaction functions for Kuno duopoly. So for the linear inverse demand function, and let's say they have some simple cost functions where they just have like variable costs. To derive the reaction function, note that firm 1 sets output such that their marginal revenue equals their marginal cost. So their marginal revenue equals their marginal cost. What's marginal cost here? C1, right? C1, the derivative of their cost function with respect to quantity, which is just C1. So for the linear demand and cost functions, this means that firm 1 is setting this marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. solving the equation for then firm 1's output in terms of firm 2's output will get us to firm 1's reaction function, how they should optimally react to changes in quantity to their rival. So that line that we saw in the graphs a second ago. So I'm just going to do the math abstractly here just to get you to a general result, but obviously the actual number examples that we'll look at after this is what you should be looking at. This is just to kind of give you a general idea of how to sort of solve for a reaction function, but you don't actually need to memorize this stuff. Just kind of track it so that you kind of understand, why you're getting to this relationship between two quantity variables versus just a number as you normally would in a non-Cournot oligopoly. Anyway, here, so now this is marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, and now you need to solve for Q1 in terms of Q2. So now you just do some math, subtract this from both sides, and then divide both sides by negative b, and that's going to get you to this expression here. So firm 1's reaction function is a function of firm 2's output, and it looks like this. The book kind of expects you to memorize this, but that's silly. Don't memorize this. Like, just understand how to get to that, and then you will easily be able to derive a reaction function, as we will see in a second. So the reaction function for firm 2 is computed similarly. In this case, because they both have the same costs, and therefore the same marginal cost, then you just you can just switch the subscripts there, and you essentially get the same type of result. All right, now let's look at an actual numerical example. Yeah.
I'm trying to understand it like on a logical point of view. So like company A will like do whatever it is that they have to do. Company B sees like what's the other firms producing. So like the
Company B, you said B.
firm A and firm B.
Yeah.
So like firm B will see what firm A is doing. So then
They won't see. They won't see because they choose their outputs at the same time. But they understand the kind of competition they're in, and so they use the reaction function to be able to set their output level. So they just know that they're in a Cournot oligopoly setting and that they should be setting their marginal revenue equal to marginal cost in this way, but including their rival's quantity variable in there, and then deriving that reaction function, which will then get them to the amount that they need to supply to maximize profits. Versus a normal setting where they just set their own marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. They only have their own quantity variable. They don't have to worry about what their rivals are doing, and it's really clear cut, which is the cases we considered prior to this chapter. All right, so suppose the inverse demand function for two Cournot duopolists is given by this inverse demand function, and their costs are 0. So we'll look at first what each firm's marginal revenue is. Then we'll look at what the reaction functions are for the two firms. Then we will solve for the Cournot equilibrium outputs, those points where the two reaction functions intersected on the graph, which is the stable point of supply for both firms in these markets. And then we'll look at what equilibrium price is. All right, so what is each firm's marginal revenue? All right, so the first step is to take the perspective of a firm. Let's pick firm 1. We're going to be firm 1. We're taking the perspective of firm 1 on the market. That means we're going to take firm 2's output as constant. So this is our perspective on the demand. Again, 10 minus Q2, firm 2's output is going to be part of my constant. I'm assuming their output is constant. So this is what's called my residual demand. So now just to derive the marginal revenue, you just double the slope. So essentially, you are now a monopolist by assuming your rival's output is constant. So now you just do what a monopolist does to maximize profits. You double your slope in absolute value to get to your marginal revenue curve. And we left it really simple as far as costs go. We said the marginal cost is equal to 0. Well, before we do that, there's our marginal revenue expressions for both firms. Essentially, we did this one a second ago, but again, they're going to be the same. You just switch the subscripts because they both have a similar perspective on the market, and so they both take the same approach to get to their marginal revenue. So you just do the same thing to get to that one. But if you know that, you can just switch the subscripts, and that's your second marginal revenue expression. All right, what are the reaction functions for the two firms? So now they have to set their marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. So setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, then we need to solve for one firm's output in terms of the other to solve for the reaction function or the best response, whatever you want to call it. So here's marginal revenue. Set that equal to marginal cost, which is equal to 0. And now you just do some algebra. You want to solve for firm 1's output, their control variable, in terms of firm 2's output, firm 2's control variable. So subtracting this from both sides gets us to this expression here, negative 10 plus Q2. And then divide both sides by negative 2 gets us to firm 1's reaction function. It's going to be equal to, in this case, 5 minus 1/2 Q2. So again, this expression tells us the equation for that reaction function that we saw on the graph earlier for firm 1. If firm 2 supplied 0, then firm 1's monopoly output would be 5. That's how much they would supply if firm 1 was the only firm in the market. It's the horizontal intercept of the reaction function in the graphs that we looked at. Firm 2's reaction function is thus going to be the same. The reason why they're the same, and we switch the subscripts, of course, just to denote the fact that this is firm 2's output as a function of firm 1's output. The reason why you can get the exact same reaction function is because the marginal revenues were set equal to the same marginal cost. If, let's say, the firms have different cost structures, then they would set their marginal revenue equal to different marginal costs, which would result in different reaction functions. So that's the only time that you would wind up with a different reaction function. So just keep that in mind. Yeah?
In that case, the number 5 is the minimum cost of the spend, so it starts with 5 and
No, that's how much they would supply. So remember, this is quantity. So it's how much they would supply if like their rival did not exist. So if they were the only firm in the market, to maximize their profits, they would supply maybe 5 tons of oil or whatever.
They don't have to pay that to compensate the expenses.
Yeah, to compensate for everything, right? We've taken all costs into consideration by setting marginal revenue equal to marginal costs. So that's been incorporated already, and so you've done that. If your rival doesn't do anything, you supply 5. But then if your rival is doing stuff, then you have to put their amount in there to figure out how much I should supply in order to continue to maximize my profits, given that now I have to compete against another firm. All right, so those are the two reaction functions. What are the equilibrium outputs? Now you just have two equations with two unknowns, so you just do some algebra. So to solve for these quantities, we plug one reaction function into the other to solve for output. So there's one of them plugging in Q2 equals 5 minus 1/2 Q1 into there. And then just doing some math to solve for Q1. So you have 5 minus 1 minus half of 5 plus 1/4 Q1 there. 5 minus 5 halves is equal to 5 halves. And then subtracting 1/4 Q1 from both sides gets us to 3/4 Q1 on the left. And then, of course, you multiply both sides by 4/3 to solve for the Cournot equilibrium output for firm 1. In this case, it happens to be 10/3. So that, again, is that quantity that corresponded to that intersection point of the two reaction functions. And to solve for firm 2's output, we plug in Q1 star into firm 2's reaction function. So you do the same thing. You plug in. So now we know how much firm 1 is going to supply. Plugging that into firm 2's reaction function tells us how much firm 2 will supply optimally in response to what firm 1 would supply. And in this case, it's going to get us to 10/3. So they're the same because the reaction functions are the same. So if the reaction functions are the same, which only happens when their costs are the same, the Cournot outputs will be the same as well. So those are the outputs. And then to solve for the prices, obviously you plug both of their quantities into our inverse demand function, and then that'll get us to the price. In this case, it equals $3.33. All right, let's just stop there, and I'll pass back the exam.